This video was shot on May 13th, 2021. It was the first dive of my first day diving what I was hoping to be an epic bucket list trip on a liveaboard in the Socorro Islands in the Pacific. And this video was shot at San Benedicto Island on our checkout dive on our very first day. You can see that it is full of life, white-tip sharks, giant manta ray. I was just in my element. But what I didn't know is that weird feeling that was in my chest during that dive was the onset of a heart attack that within 12 hours I would be back in a hospital in an intensive care unit. If any of you out there follow my channel, you probably saw some of the videos around my 50th birthday, an epic bucket list dive trip to the Socorro Islands on the Nautilus Bellamy liveaboard. We're going to spend 8 days diving around the Socorro Islands, and I was just in my element. But on May 13th, 2021, the day before my 50th birthday, on the first dive of the first day, I experienced a heart attack. I was emergency evacuated from a Mexican naval base on a small plane, life flight, flown at 1,000 feet for an hour and a half back to Cabo San Lucas, and spent the next 3 days in a hospital, 2 of those days in an intensive care unit. What I plan to do today is give you a follow-up on exactly what occurred during that trip, what I found out about my heart, and also what are the financial ramifications of having such an event occur in such a remote part of the world. Welcome to Everything Scuba. Hey guys, welcome back to Everything Scuba. I am Lyell. Kind of a little bit of an intense opening there to our video. A few months after, let's say, my cardiac event, if we want to call it that, we produced a video called Are You Fit to Dive? And during that, we delved into the statistics that Divers Alert Network provides, looking at the growing reason and possibly the #1 cause for fatalities amongst divers these days, and that is cardiovascular disease, such as heart attacks, which is something that I suffered. Thankfully, I'm still here to tell the story, but in my case, after we took time to analyze the events both before and during my dive, and then through a battery of extensive cardiac testing that I underwent at Rochester in Minnesota with the Mayo Clinic Cardiology Group, they also hooked me up with hyperbaric medicine. Those are physicians who fully understand diving and dive physiology as they work in pressure chambers for treatment of a variety of different disease processes. But they put me through some VO2 max testing. We discovered that I probably suffered the perfect storm of events that created my heart attack. The type of heart attack that I suffered in medical parlance, they would call it a MINOCA, and that stands for M-I-N-O-C-A. That is a myocardial infarction or a heart attack with no coronary artery disease. I was flown to Cabo San Lucas, then transported to a hospital called St. Luke's in Cabo San Jose. There were definite changes within my EKG that showed some damage to the backside of my heart, and also through some blood tests that showed that I have elevated cardiac enzymes, which is kind of that hallmark of an ongoing heart attack. So I underwent a cardiac catheterization and woke up with the cardiologist telling me, hey, you have absolutely no blockages. So I was a little puzzled. How did I have a heart attack with no coronary artery disease? Well, about 5 to 10% of heart attacks are thought to occur with no coronary artery disease, no blockages in the actual coronary vessels. Initially, while in Mexico, the cardiologist thought that I had perhaps suffered something called a coronary artery vasospasm. That is basically where the artery closes down and simulates what a blockage would do and starves the heart muscle of oxygenation. But through testing with the cardiologist at Mayo Clinic, they actually believe I suffered what is known as a Takotsubo syndrome, also known as broken-hearted syndrome. Takotsubo syndrome, which is kind of appropriate for a diver, a Takotsubo pot is a Japanese pot that is used to capture octopus. But the name Takotsubo syndrome is used because the shape that the heart changes to is similar to the shape of the Takotsubo pot. There is a dilation of primarily the left ventricular side of the heart that is basically an acute failure of your heart to pump blood effectively out to the rest of your body, and creates a similar effect to that of a heart attack. The good news is about Takotsubo syndrome is, from the reading that I've done, which has been extensive since I had this happen to me, there's only a 5 to 10% chance of recurrence of this. And obviously I'm going to be very careful never to put myself in the same situation again. And thankfully, because through testing I know there was no damage to my heart muscle itself, the perfusion, the way that blood flows through my heart and the muscle itself, there was no damage. And so I have been cleared to return to all normal activities, back to teaching and back to diving. But around that time I really wasn't sure what was going to happen with the rest of my diving career. So thankful to the cardiologists at Mayo Clinic for doing what they did. However, when we stand back and look at the costs associated with what occurred to me during that trip, that might be enough to give you another heart attack. And that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of this episode. The costs involved in having a heart attack while scuba diving, and how did we manage around that? So, just how expensive is it to have a heart attack while scuba diving? It obviously could cost you the greatest expense of all, and that is your life. And like I said earlier, I'm thankful to still be here talking to you guys and enjoying the sport that we all love. Let's break it down for my situation. First up was the cost of the flights, the hotels before and after the dive trip that I had planned. The dive trip itself was going to be 8 days aboard the Nautilus Bellamy diving the Socorro Islands, and all of the other associated costs with getting all my gear out there. That totaled about $12,000. The evacuation from the ship to the Mexican naval base and the life flight. Well, the life flight included one critical care specialist who flew down from Cabo San Jose, and I believe there was 3 nurses also on that flight. It was a small single-engine plane that flew at 1,000 feet for an hour and a half. The cost of that was $129,000 just to get me from the Mexican naval base all the way back to Cabo San Jose to the hospital. Next came the hospitalization at St. Luke's Hospital. I have to say I received just excellent care from the cardiologist and the emergency staff within that hospital. I spent 3 days in the hospital there, underwent a battery of tests initially, cardiac catheterization. Also prior to that, I had a chest CT just to rule out any type of lung injury that may have occurred during a dive, and 2 days in the intensive care unit, and 1 day in a regular hospital bed before I was discharged to take a flight home back to the United States. The total cost of that came to $253,000 for those 3 days. To leave the hospital, I actually had to find $30,000 of my own personal money to be discharged. Because I live here in the United States and I have private health insurance, my carrier is United Healthcare, in order to determine what costs were involved and whether my health insurance would cover any part of this, St. Luke's Hospital works with a third-party company which is based in Florida to do their billing for them. And here in the United States, they use a system called ICD-10, which is a coding system in order to identify all of the things that were done for me in hospital in an itemized fashion. And so it took a long time, one, for St. Luke's to provide that information to the third-party company, and then for the third-party company to put that information together. In the first 6 months, repeatedly, United Healthcare denied all charges because they did not have complete information or a complete itemized bill to work from to make that determination. So that was certainly a stressful period for me and my family, because at that point in time we really didn't know what the total bill was. I knew I had paid $30,000 just to leave the hospital, but I had no idea how much additional charges were involved. I had no idea at that point what the emergency life flight cost either. But after about 12 months, yes, a full year of phone calls, emails, trying to determine what was going on, we got a final determination on what the costs were for everything involved and what my healthcare insurance would be willing to pay. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about dive insurance and how that helped me in this situation. So I carry Divers Alert Network dive insurance. I am a Guardian Plan member. If you know anything about Dan, they are a phenomenal organization. They have done and continue to do amazing things for divers. But I got a real education into exactly how dive insurance works, or sometimes won't work for you in this instance. So there's a few things that we all need to keep in mind in order to allow Dan's network of insurance to provide coverage for you. Number one, during the emergency event, thankfully, the crew on board contacted Dan physicians directly. And that was key because they were in touch with physicians on land discussing my particular situation, and it was their physicians that recommended that I be evacuated. And that is a key aspect to making sure that if you're covered by Dan or another type of organization, that they have the go-ahead to evacuate you based on their physician's recommendations. Otherwise, that might prevent coverage being offered. The second part to know is if you're like me living in the United States, or if you're in a country with a private healthcare system, Dan's insurance company will not make any payment until your primary healthcare carrier has made determination on what they will and will not cover. And once your healthcare carrier has determined what they're going to cover, they need to make that payment, and then they're going to provide to you, at least here in the United States, we call it an EOB, which is an explanation of benefits. It basically outlines the charges involved and what that health insurance will cover. You then have to provide that EOB to Dan directly to allow them to determine what they will then cover based on your dive insurance coverage. So before I get into the details of the costs involved and what was covered and what was not covered, I grew up in the United Kingdom. United Kingdom has a national health care system, and I'm curious about other countries. What would happen if, obviously I live in the United States, I have private health insurance, I know how that system works. Is it perfect? By no means, but eventually things kind of worked out. I'm curious if you live in the UK, if you live in other countries, how would this event be handled? Leave some comments down below. I'd love to hear if there's other divers out there who have experienced a similar thing. How did your country's system actually get you through this, or did they get you through this? So first up, the life flight. $129,000 to get me from point A to point B so I could be back to the hospital. That was covered by my healthcare insurance, United Healthcare, to a tune of $126,000. They covered almost the entire thing. I received the explanation of benefits from my insurance company. I turned it over to a Dan representative, and within 3 days, they had made payment for the rest of that $3,000. The entire $129,000 were covered between my healthcare insurance and Dan directly. So out-of-pocket expense to me, $0. The hospitalization costs of $253,000. I had forked over $30,000 of my own money, and I was very hopeful that that $30,000 would be returned to me, assuming my healthcare insurance would kick in or my dive insurance would help out. It so happened that my United Healthcare coverage covered the entire bill. Now, we have no way of knowing if they paid $253,000. Within the United States, whether you know it or not, insurance companies that do this kind of business have agreements with certain hospitals of what they will and won't cover, and if those hospitals participate, then they may not have to pay the $253,000. Regardless, I received a check from United Healthcare for $30,000 a few months ago to recoup my costs that I had to pay at the time. So very happy about that. Last up is the costs involved in my travel, my flights, the loss of my trip. All of those costs total about $12,000. Previously, I have carried travel insurance with Divers Alert Network. They also offer travel insurance in addition to dive insurance. And what unfortunately I realized is I had let that lapse. I had not followed up and completed my renewal for the year 2021. And so I did not have any travel insurance in place. Some of my credit card companies that I use when I purchase flights were able to help me with replacing some of those costs to a tune of about $3,000, but ultimately I left about $8,000 or $9,000 on the table, which essentially I just lost. So based on all of this information, I have a few tips that I want to give you divers out there. If you're thinking of taking a big dive trip, let's look at them. So my first tip, probably the biggest tip of all, do not have a heart attack while scuba diving. Whatever you can do, try not to have a heart attack while scuba diving. Be a fit diver, take care of yourself. I thought I was a relatively fit diver, but obviously you can't always plan for accidents. Tip number 2, since you can't always plan for accidents, look into protecting yourself with dive accident insurance. Be aware of the fact there are certain things that will and will not be covered, and also, like I talked about, there are some very specific things that have to happen to make sure that coverage takes effect. And previously we produced a variety of videos in relation to Divers Alert Network. The first one of which is, click that link right up above me. It'll tell you all about Dan's dive accident insurance policy, and in fact they just brought out some expanded coverage, which we plan to bring you a video about that in the near future. Tip number 3, consider travel insurance. We all think it's never going to happen to us. I never thought that I was ever going to be in this situation. But again, Divers Alert Network, they offer additional supplemental travel insurance which will cover costs above and beyond that of your dive accident insurance. And lastly, if you would like to learn more about what exactly happened and what exactly caused my Takotsubo syndrome heart attack, a few days after I arrived home after that heart attack, I made a video. Click this link right here and go check out exactly what occurred to me. As always, thanks for watching, and dive safely, friends.